Hello, this is Miss Kyler, and for this lesson, we're going to talk about the origins of the short story. The modern short story came from fables, parables, and fairy tales. And the question we are exploring is, what do stories tell us? Why are we expected to read stories anyway? So let's think about that. First of all, we're going to look at fables. Fables were told by a Greek called Aesop, who was born in 600 BC. A fable is a short narrative in which characters, often animals, illustrate a lesson. This lesson is called a moral. So here's a famous fable, The Tortoise and the Hare. And the moral of that story was, slow and steady wins the race. Even though the hare was faster, the tortoise kept plugging along and was the one to finally win the race because he just kept going. Another famous one is The Mouse and the Lion. The lion spares the mouse, therefore the mouse is able to get all his little mousy friends to come and save the lion later on. The moral of that story is no act of kindness, however small, is ever wasted. Okay, so another type of story are parables. A parable is a story about everyday life that teaches us a lesson. A lesson is usually a spiritual lesson. Jesus taught with parables in the gospel. And in Luke 10:25-37, we read the parable of the Good Samaritan. In that parable, we learn who our neighbor really is. We may think that the people that we trust, the high officials, the important people in society, are the ones that we can be friends with, but usually the one who's our real friend is the person we least expect. Okay, so a little later on, more in the Middle Ages, we had fairy tales. The Brothers Grimm were the ones that perpetuated these tales. They went around Europe and gathered these from the common people. And a fairy tale is a story, usually for children, that involves magical creatures or circumstances. The purpose of a fairy tale is to introduce children to the deeper concepts of life, like obedience, consequences for your actions, dangers in society, death, marriage, and poverty. So we're kind of getting the first hints of deeper meaning in a story. So when you're reading a fairy tale, you'll find these basic elements. Usually there's a formulaic introduction and conclusion. Once upon a time, and they lived happily ever after, that sort of thing. We see the good character versus evil character. So we're having the very first introduction of protagonist and antagonist. There's often royalty and castles. So we're also looking at the hierarchy of society. Magical or supernatural elements like spells, wishes, talking animals, fairy godmothers, that sort of thing. And we have a basic problem and a solution. So we're having the very first conflict introduced here. And things often happen in threes and sevens. There's often like 3 wishes, 3 bears, 7 dwarves, etc. It's very interesting, the formulas you find in fairy tales. Now, the fairy tale provides the structure for the modern short story. So we find that introduction, there's good versus evil, sort of a conflict going on. Then there's that problem is introduced, and then the solution at the end. And then we have the conclusion where everything's tied up in a nice little package for us. So that's like modern plot line for the modern short story. We have the exposition where we introduce everything and where we are and who we have here. The conflicts begins, and that leads to the rising action, which leads to the climax. That was where it all comes together and a decision has to be made. And that decision results in the falling action, the consequences. And after that, it's all tied up, right? It's all wrapped up into a nice little knot in the denouement. Okay, so one famous fairy tale is Little Red Riding Hood. It gives you a basic structure here. So we introduce our character, Little Red Riding Hood. And her mother gives her a little basket to take to her grandma, and her mom tells her, be careful, stay on the path, don't go off the path, don't go wandering around, and don't talk to strangers, go straight to grandma's. And along comes a talking wolf, this sort of magical creature here, and he starts talking to her so nicely that she tells him exactly where she's going and why she's going there and how to get there. And the wolf tempts her into stopping to pick some flowers. So that sounds like a good idea to Red Riding Hood. Even though her mother did tell her not to go off the path, there couldn't be any harm in stopping to get some flowers for Grandma. So she stops, picks the flowers, and meanwhile, sneaky, sneaky, sneaky goes the wolf. And he sneaks up to Grandma's. Grandma happens to be out in the version I like to tell, and so the wolf lets himself in. He gets dressed up in Grandma's outfit. So when Red Riding Hood gets there, she goes through her little big eyes, big teeth routine, and is about ready to be killed by the wolf, except along comes a handy woodsman who is able to destroy the wolf and also protect Grandma and Red Riding Hood. And so they're able to enjoy the treats while the woodsman out there in the window takes the wolf away. And the lesson of that, of course, is you need to obey your parents. And it says at the end that Red Riding Hood never disobeyed her mother ever again. She learned her lesson. So here's some concepts that we learn from fairy tales. Like we said in Little Red Riding Hood, obedience to your parents and the consequences for your actions. In Sleeping Beauty, one of the big concepts is death, which they discuss through sleep, very deep, long sleep. Three Little Pigs, of course, is hard work, don't be lazy. And Hansel and Gretel really explores, in a very complex way, poverty and what happens, what you have to deal with when you're very, very poor. Okay, so here's a little review for what we talked about. Fables, parables, and fairy tales all are stories that teach lessons. Fables teach us a moral through simple stories about animals. Parables teach us spiritual lessons through simple stories about everyday life. And fairy tales establish the basic structure of modern short stories and teach us difficult concepts about life. This will lead us to what we're going to be talking about for a lot of this semester, and that is that the modern short story teaches us about the complexity of society and humanity. And that is why we read short stories, is to learn about things about society and humanity that we don't usually get to glimpse in our little cloistered lives. Thank you, and make sure you review before the quiz. Bye.